The champagne was warm. That was the first thing I noticed when my future mother-in-law handed me a glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I should have left right then. My name is Caleb Merritt. I'm 32 years old. I built a software company from a second-hand laptop on a folding table in a studio apartment in Columbus, Ohio. By the time I met Claire Ashford, my company, Merritt Analytics, was processing logistics data for 14 mid-sized manufacturers across the Midwest. Not flashy, not the kind of thing that gets you on magazine covers, but real. Profitable. Mine. I wasn't looking for anyone when I found her. Or maybe she found me. It was at a trade conference in Chicago. The kind of event where everyone wears a lanyard and pretends to care about panel discussions. I was skipping one of those panels, sitting at the hotel bar with a coffee, going over a contract on my laptop, when someone sat down next to me and said, "You know they have an entire room full of people discussing the future of supply chain optimization right now." I looked up. She was smiling, not the polished kind of smile you practice in a mirror. Something easier than that. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." She laughed and ordered a sparkling water. Her name was Claire. She told me she worked in urban planning consulting. She asked me what I did, and when I told her, she asked a real question about it. Not the kind of polite nodding people do when they don't actually care, but a question that showed she'd understood what I said. We talked for 2 hours. I missed every panel I'd planned to attend. I didn't ask for her number that night. She found me the next morning before the first session and handed me her card. I called her 3 days later. For the first 8 months, everything between us felt like something I hadn't known I was missing. Claire was sharp and curious and patient with the parts of me that were still figuring out how to be in a relationship. I had spent most of my 20s building the company. I didn't have a lot of practice at this. She didn't seem to mind. She'd come to my apartment on Friday nights with takeout, and we'd sit on the floor with the coffee table covered in blueprints of her current project and my revenue projections, and we'd just exist in the same space, working side by side, occasionally reading each other something interesting from whatever we were looking at. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I knew Claire came from money. She mentioned her family a handful of times in those early months, offhand references to a house in Charleston, a father who sat on a few boards, a mother who organized charity fundraisers. I didn't give it much thought. Claire herself lived simply. She drove a used Civic. She split dinner checks without being asked. She seemed, by every measure I had, to be her own person. I fell in love with that person. I proposed 9 months in, at Lakewood Park on a Thursday evening in October. Nothing dramatic. We were walking the path along the water, and I had the ring in my jacket pocket, and I just stopped and asked her. She cried a little. So did I, which I wasn't expecting. She said yes before I finished the sentence. That night, lying awake in the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down. I should have known that feeling wouldn't last. Claire wanted me to meet her parents. I understood that. We'd been together almost a year and I hadn't met them yet. Something she explained away by saying they traveled often and her mother was particular about timing. I didn't push. When she finally brought it up seriously, about 2 weeks after the engagement, she had a careful look on her face that I noticed but didn't press. "My mother can be a lot," she said. "Just give her a chance, okay? She warms up." I told her, of course. I meant it. Her parents lived in a suburb outside of Charleston, in a house that was less a home and more a statement. I drove down on a Saturday in November. Claire had flown ahead 2 days earlier to, as she put it, prepare things. I told myself that was normal. Families have dynamics. I knew mine wasn't typical. My father had been an electrician, my mother a dental hygienist, and we'd grown up in a house in Dayton that was clean and small and full of noise. I wasn't ashamed of any of that, it just wasn't this. Her father, Richard Ashford, met me at the door. He was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired, firm handshake, the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more interesting with age. He looked at me with what I can only describe as careful assessment. Not warmth, not hostility, just evaluation. "Caleb," he said, "Claire's told us about you." "Good things, I hope," I said. He smiled briefly and showed me inside. The house was the kind of decorated to perform taste rather than express it. Everything matched too well. There were flowers on the entryway table that looked like they had been professionally arranged that morning. I was led through a hallway lined with framed photos. Claire at what appeared to be a debutante event. Claire at graduation. Claire with her parents in front of landmarks I recognized as expensive destinations. In none of the photos was she smiling the way she smiled at me. We came into the sitting room and I met her mother. Margaret Ashford was a small woman who took up a lot of space. She was impeccably dressed, not a thread out of place, with the kind of still, controlled expression that people develop when they've spent decades deciding how much to let others see. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're not sure matches the room. "So you're Caleb," she said. She didn't stand. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "It's nice to finally meet you." She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and gestured to a chair across from her. Claire was sitting on the small sofa beside her mother. She caught my eye and gave me a small encouraging smile. I sat down. The first hour was what I'd call a structured interview with the pretense of conversation. Margaret asked about my company, not with curiosity, but with the tone of someone assessing a loan application. How long had it been operating? What was the revenue? Was I the sole owner or did I have partners? Who were my investors? I answered everything honestly. The company had been running for 6 years. We turned profitable in year 3. I owned 80%. I had no outside investors. I'd bootstrapped it and was proud of that. When I said that last part, Margaret tilted her head slightly. "No investors," she repeated, as if I'd said something puzzling. "So it's quite small then." "It's doing well," I said. "Richard," she said, turning to her husband. "Didn't the Kellerman's son just raise a Series B?" Richard nodded without much enthusiasm. I looked at Claire. She was looking at her hands. We went in for dinner. The table was set with the kind of formality that makes eating feel like a test. Her mother had hired someone to cook, and the food was genuinely excellent. I'll give her that. There was wine, a red that was served at a temperature I later learned was slightly too warm, which struck me as a small and telling thing. You can know all the rules and still get it wrong. I was doing fine. I was answering questions, asking my own, trying to be present and genuine. Richard had warmed slightly. He asked a few real questions about the analytics side of my work, and I could tell there was a mind behind the boardroom polish. We had an actual exchange for a few minutes about automation and manufacturing. It was the first moment in the evening that felt like I was being treated as a person and not a variable. Then Margaret set down her fork. "I'd like to talk about the wedding," she said. Claire looked up. Something in her expression shifted, barely perceptible, but I caught it. "Of course," I said. "We have expectations," Margaret said. Claire was raised in a certain way. Our family has standing in this community. A wedding is not simply a party, it is a statement. "I understand that," I said. "Claire and I haven't nailed down all the details yet, but we would expect a venue that reflects our family's position," she continued, as though I hadn't spoken. "The club, ideally. 250 guests at minimum. A rehearsal dinner the evening before. A proper honeymoon, somewhere significant." I nodded slowly. "Those are things Claire and I can discuss and figure out together." Margaret looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen yet. It was the look of someone who has been patient for as long as they intend to be. "I'm going to be direct with you, Caleb," she said. "Please," I said. "A wedding of the standard our family expects will cost, conservatively, $150,000. Given your background and your—" She paused, the pause doing more work than any word could. "Situation. We would expect you to contribute $100,000 of that, as a gesture of seriousness, of commitment to Claire's future." The table went quiet. I want to tell you I kept my face completely neutral. I mostly did. I took one breath. I looked at Margaret. Then I looked at Claire. Claire was looking at the tablecloth. "That's an interesting way to frame a wedding budget," I said. My voice came out even, which surprised me. "It's not a frame," Margaret said. "It's a condition." "A condition," I repeated. "You're asking to marry my daughter. My daughter has a life, a standard, a community. If you cannot demonstrate that you are prepared to invest in that life, I'd like to hear from Claire," I said. Everyone looked at Claire. She looked up slowly, and the thing I had been half hoping and half dreading was resolved in that moment. because what I saw in her face wasn't surprise or discomfort or the look of someone who hadn't known this was coming. She said, "Caleb, I think my mother makes a fair point." Something in my chest went completely still. "You think it's fair," I said quietly. "It's just, my family has a reputation. This is how things are done here. I didn't think it would be a problem for you financially." I sat with that for a moment, the way she said it. I didn't think it would be a problem for you financially. As if the only reasonable objection I could have was an inability to pay. As if the question of whether being asked to purchase entry into a family was in itself the problem hadn't occurred to her. "It's not about whether I can," I said. "Then what's the issue?" Margaret said. "The issue," I said, "is that you framed loving your daughter as something I need to pay for." Margaret's expression didn't change exactly, but something hardened behind it. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "This is how families of our background handle these things. You clearly didn't grow up with this, so I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you don't understand the tradition." And there it was. The thing she'd been holding since I walked through the door finally said out loud, "You don't understand because of where you come from." I looked at Richard. He was cutting his food with focused attention, the way a person does when they've decided not to be in a room they're physically present in. I looked at Claire. She was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something careful and calculating and slightly braced, like she was waiting to see which version of this conversation she was going to get. I put my napkin on the table. "Excuse me for a moment," I said. I walked out of the dining room and stood in the hallway for about 90 seconds, looking at the photos of Claire at all her milestones, and I thought about something she'd said to me once, early on, when I'd told her about my father getting laid off when I was in high school, and how that had been the thing that made me decide I'd never be at the mercy of someone else's decision about my worth. She'd said, "I love that about you." I walked back into the dining room. I sat down. I picked up my fork. We finished the meal without much conversation. Margaret made a few attempts to steer back toward the topic of the wedding. I answered politely and without commitment. Claire watched me with that same careful expression. Richard asked me one more question about my company, something about data security, and I answered it fully because that, at least, was a real question. After dinner, we moved back to the sitting room for coffee. Margaret was talking about something related to a charity board she chaired, and I sat and listened, and when there was a pause, I said, "I need to tell you both something." Margaret looked at me. "I appreciate the dinner and the hospitality," I said. "I want to be straightforward with you about where I stand. I love Claire. I would like to marry her, but I won't be paying a fee to do so. That's not a negotiation point. That's just where I stand." Margaret set her coffee cup down with a small, precise click. "Then I'm not sure what you expect from this family," she said. "I don't expect anything from this family," I said. "I expected to be marrying Claire." I looked at Claire when I said that. She said nothing. I said, "I think I'm going to head to the hotel." I stood up and shook Richard's hand, which he gave without quite meeting my eyes. I nodded to Margaret. I looked at Claire one more time. She walked me to the door. On the front step, in the cold, she said, "You could have just said you'd think about it." I looked at her for a long moment. "Claire, did you know that was coming tonight?" She was quiet for 2 full seconds. 2 seconds is a long time when you're waiting for the answer to something important. "She mentioned she wanted to talk about contributions," Claire said. I didn't know exactly what she was going to say. "But you weren't surprised," I said. She didn't answer, which was an answer. "Okay," I said. I drove to the hotel. I lay in the dark for a while and thought about the fact that the person I'd wanted to build a life with had sat across a table while her mother told me to pay for the privilege of her love, and had decided that was a fair point. The next morning, I called my attorney. Here's the thing about merit analytics that Margaret Ashford had not done her homework on, or had dismissed as insignificant because the name wasn't large enough to appear in the publications she read. My company had, in the previous 18 months, taken on a data management contract with Ashford Capital's third largest portfolio company, a regional manufacturer called Brennan Industrial, based in South Carolina. The contract was worth just over $400,000 annually. It had been brokered through a mutual connection, and if the Ashford family had ever looked carefully at who was servicing their portfolio company's data infrastructure, they would have found my name. They had not looked carefully. I drafted a termination notice that morning. I was well within my contractual right to exit with 60 days notice, which I gave. My attorney reviewed it and sent it before noon. I was back in Columbus by Sunday evening. Claire called me 3 times on the drive back. I didn't answer. She texted, "Can we talk about this?" I texted back, "Give me a few days." She sent a longer message that I read once and then put my phone face down on the passenger seat. She called again on Tuesday. I answered. "My mother is upset," she said. "About what?" I said, though I already knew. Brennan Industrial. Apparently Merit Analytics terminated a contract with them. My father is saying it's going to create real problems for their Q1 reporting. "That's an operational decision I made," I said. "Caleb." Her voice was tight. "Did you do that because of what happened at dinner?" I thought about that question. I thought about the careful ways she'd said I didn't think it would be a problem for you financially. I thought about the 2 seconds of silence when I asked if she'd known. "I did it," I said, "because I realized I was doing business in proximity to people who don't respect me. That's bad for any company, and I should have caught it sooner." "That's not fair." "Claire," I said, "your mother told me to pay 6 figures for the right to marry you." You said she made a fair point. I think we have different definitions of fair. There was a long silence. "So that's it," she said. I thought about Lakewood Park, the ring in my jacket pocket, the way she'd cried a little, the way I had too. "I don't know what it is yet," I said honestly, "but I know I won't be paying anyone to prove I'm worth loving, and if you needed me to at least perform consideration of that, to say I'd think about it, the way you said at the door, then I think you need to think about what that tells you about what you actually want." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "My mother isn't going to change." "I know," I said. "And you're not going to pay." "No," I said. "I'm not." Another silence. Longer this time. "I don't know how to do this without her support," Claire said, and her voice had changed, softer, something genuinely sad in it, the first real thing she'd said since dinner. "I know," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't angry at her for that. Some people are built around their families in ways that aren't easy to see until something pulls at the structure. But I can't be the one who pays for that either, literally or otherwise. We talked for another 20 minutes. It wasn't a fight. It was something sadder and more final than a fight. When we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time looking at nothing in particular. I returned the ring to the jeweler 2 weeks later. I heard through a mutual connection, about 4 months after that Brennan Industrial had brought in an outside firm to handle the transition, at significant cost, and that the disruption had in fact affected the Ashford portfolio's quarterly numbers. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something more like the specific tiredness that comes after you've done something hard and correct. I still think about Claire sometimes, not with anger, with the particular sadness you feel for something that was real and then turned out to be built on a foundation you didn't know was cracked. The version of her I met at the hotel bar in Chicago, curious and easy and genuinely present. I believe that person was real. I think she's still in there somewhere, underneath the years of learning what her family expected her to be. I hope she finds her way to something better. I kept building the company. 14 clients became 21. I hired 4 more people. I moved into an actual office. Nothing fancy. A converted warehouse space on the east side of Columbus with exposed brick and bad parking, and I love it unreasonably. I haven't gotten engaged again. I'm in no rush. I've learned something about the patience required to know a person fully before you decide they're someone you want to build a life with. Not just the version of them they bring to a hotel bar in Chicago, but the version that exists in the room where their mother is. I've learned to pay attention early, and I've learned, this above everything, that the measure of what you're worth is never the number someone else puts on it. Not a price tag, not a condition, not a glass of champagne offered with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I set my own value. I built it from the ground up, alone, on a folding table with a second-hand laptop, in an apartment so small I could hear my neighbor's television through the wall. No one gets to tell me what that's worth.